to that would be, you know, for someone like you who has memories of the time specifically, and then you have the whole mediated archive of the 60s to draw from as well. Whereas, you know, I've interviewed, you know, contemporary mods who love to recreate that whole era, music-wise, fashion-wise, everything, but they have no lived experience of that era. So how does both, you know, your memories and mediated imagery of the 60s play into your process?
Well, you know, I grew up in the Midwest, and in Indianapolis, I mean, the Beatles did come there. They played a cow barn, really, and it was at the State Fairgrounds. It was just, you know, it was the worst acoustics that you can imagine. It was a tin ceiling, and it was just abysmal, and they had no monitor speakers, and it was just mostly shrieking. I actually have a recording of this. And so basically, you know, in the Midwest, particularly in this part of the Midwest, it wasn't, Indianapolis was not like Chicago. It was not even like Cincinnati. You know, it was like things filtered in very gradually. And so, you know, in terms of how I reference that in the series that I've really just started, the Beatles series, in terms of, you know, I'm addressing each album. What we in the Midwest saw of the Beatles and any of the other bands, were you would get the album. It would be you know, a 12 or 13 by 13-inch record cover, and you would like study it. You would know who the producer was. You knew who, you know, everything was. And okay. So part of my interest is actually the packaging, how these things were promoted and how they appeared. And you know, it's not like we could, it's not like we knew any of these people. It was all about how it was presented via, you know, American corporations. The Beatles in particular were presented by Capitol out of Los Angeles, and Capitol didn't really want them, and Capitol was a subsidiary of EMI, an English company, who kept pressuring them, saying, this is going to be big, and they were going, we've got the Beach Boys, what do we need the Beatles for, you know? So they finally, you know, after giving away the first album and the first single to tiny, VJ put out the first Beatles record here. It was a tiny black-owned Gary, Indiana record label, and the first single, She Loves You, was put out on Swan, and I don't even know where they were from, but small labels. So.
An indie band before.
Yeah,
a monolithic
by default,
band.
An indie band. Yeah,
right.
The Beatles.
First indie
Underrated,
band.
vastly underrated.
So what made the difference? What made the difference?
In
moving them from the Swan label to the biggest phenomenon in America?
I assume corporate pressure, and also there was this fortuitous meeting where Ed Sullivan, or maybe it was his son-in-law, was getting off at Heathrow at a point where the Beatles were leaving, and there was a mob scene, and he went back and told his father-in-law, like, this is a phenomena, it's a cultural phenomena, and it's going to be here, you know, one way or another. And then I think they were booked on the Ed Sullivan Show, and then Capitol said, we better, you know, they started trying to buy up all the rights of the things that they had let slide to begin with, I think.
So happenstance, really?
Yeah, well, it was you know, one of those synchronistic...
Right.
Yeah.
So, Pauline, I wanted to ask you before we get more in depth in terms of also this idea of crossing over between popular music and fine visual arts. I think this is an appropriate time to ask you about your brother, Stuart Sutcliffe, and how his life and work ties into what we're talking about here today in the context of Kevin's exhibit, because not everyone here may be in the know in terms of his artwork or musical career and such. So I was hoping you could fill everyone in.
I mean, that's such a profound question. I'm sitting here trying to make a link between Stuart's artwork and Kevin's, and the only link is the Beatles, really, isn't it? Because Stuart's work doesn't visually look like Kevin's, but if we're talking about shifts in culture and revolutions, this is the last catalogue. Kevin, I think you ought to help me out with this question.
Well,
I mean, what do you think the links are, artistically?
One major link is that we're both primarily visual artists who ended up playing in bands. MX80 was not exactly, it wasn't even the Beatles of Bloomington, Indiana. It was, you know, it was a good band, and that would be the primary thing, is people that are primarily visual artists who love music and play music. I mean, you know, there's Larry Rivers, great painter, played saxophone his whole life. Apparently Picasso used to blow a bugle as soon as he went into the studio every morning. Maybe it was a trumpet. I think it was a bugle. Wasn't exactly a musician, but you know, there's that thing.
Well, yes, and of course, remembering in the 60s that lots of bands either were at art school or had dropped out of art school, and of course that's how Stuart and John met, at art school. So you're right. I mean, there was a very strong musical connection, as well as the fine art connection between a lot of these bands.
I think also, if you look at a band like the Doors, for instance, these were, you know, Jim Morrison was somebody who was, you know, writing poetry, and I think Ray Manzarek maybe was a film student at UCLA or something. So there was this thing that was happening, I think, in the 60s, and you saw it a lot in England. A lot of the musicians in the English bands, the first English bands, happened to meet at art school. And I think starting in the middle 60s in this country, you saw more and more of that. I mean, you look at a band like the Talking Heads, I think they all met at RISD or something. I mean, it's just like now it's part of, you go to art school and you drop out and you have a rock band or something. And
well, and there seemed to be such a cross-fertilization between visual arts and pop music at this time. And we see it, for instance, the Tate Modern in 2004 had an Art in the 60s exhibit. And there were so many images, not just from the pop art movement in England in the early to mid 60s, a lot of the images were of that time, but there were also photographs, you know, of the Beatles, of Mick Jagger, the Rolling Stones, Keith Richards. And I'm also curious how the work you do visually is reflected in the music that you make. Is it more the influence the other way around, the music on the visual, or what kind of
you know,
influences there the other way around?
I have spent some time trying to figure that out. I've never really got a handle on it. Sometimes I'll get an idea for a lyric when I'm painting. I mean, one of the things that's funny now, I don't usually listen to rock music in the studio. You know, oftentimes I listen to like spoken word, and you'd probably be shocked if I told you what it was. But you know, I've listened to everything. I listened from, you know, family systems therapists down to like hillbilly preachers from Oklahoma. You know, it just depends on what I, you know, but I get some type of, you know, electricity from that. And the music I've been listening to lately is this group Anonymous 4, and they do like medieval, like, you know, carols and that sort of thing. And they did a bunch of pieces by Hildegard von Bingen, you know, an abbess from like the Middle Ages, and somebody who was like walled into this well, it wouldn't be called, it would be an abbey, and you know, she would send out these manuscripts of this music, and did these paintings and whatnot. So I can listen to that sort of thing and get information that will inform lyrics that I would write or something. In terms of melody or that sort of thing, I usually come up with melodies when I'm, you know, running, because you sort of run in 4/4. And I mean, I'd like to write jazz, but I can't. I write rock, you know, because it's all jazz doesn't go like this, rock does, you know. So it's